Hey, this is a video for 5.7, Meat Production Methods. So go ahead and check out the overview and set up your guided notes. So to produce the meat that we need, the food that we need, meat products for a growing population, we need to increase the amount that is produced. And we do this in these concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as CAFOs or feedlots. And they're these giant sheds or barns with animals living basically on top of each other in one giant cage. Now this will increase the amount of meat produced per area. However, it will also lead to a lot of profits. But the population density is so high that antibiotics are required, so we're not spreading diseases. There's also an issue with the waste disposal. There can be pros and cons to the waste disposal, which I'll discuss. And also we're releasing greenhouse gases. So because of this generation of waste, the nitrogen cycle is impacted, meaning more nitrous oxide is given off during denitrification. But also we have carbon dioxide released from the animals themselves, from the decomposition of the waste, and also from the fossil fuels that are combusted in order to maintain these operations. There's a lot of methane that is released, especially from the raising of cattle, because cows belch, cows fart, and they do that because they have a diet that is predominantly grain-based. Also, people wonder and question the ethical treatment of these animals. My nieces and nephew used to work in a CAFO, a turkey CAFO in Wisconsin. And I have in the past shared photos and videos of some of these animals, and it is not the best conditions. If you are interested, I'm not going to subject you to these images, but if you are interested, you can Google it easily. It's kind of sad sometimes. But for all intents and purposes, these operations are not good, and they are there's a lot of environmental degradation that is associated with these operations. So some of these impacts, the reason we have CAFOs is to feed a growing human population. So obviously we need to provide food, but then that leads to a lot of impacts. We have to use a lot of antibiotics, so we're preventing any sort of disease contamination. That can lead to resistant bacteria, which is the pesticide treadmill concept that we spoke about during the past video. Because we need to feed these organisms, and especially with the production of beef, we are monocropping a lot of corn, and that is because they're given a grain-based diet as opposed to a grass-based diet. And that can lead to biodiversity loss because of all the impacts that are associated with monocropping. There is a lot of methane that is emitted because of the anaerobic digestion. This is especially true for cows. They have a symbiotic relationship with anaerobic bacteria, so they help to decompose the products that they are eating so the cows can obtain the nutrients. But because methane is released, that is a greenhouse gas, and that can lead to climate change, again, biodiversity loss. So we have a lot of waste that is built up. And in order to treat this waste, there's no toilet to flush it down. That would be somebody else's problem, and that's not how it works. These CAFOs have a manure lagoon, and a manure lagoon is basically just, it's a man-made basin that's collecting the animal waste, and then it allows it to anaerobically decompose. So the way it works is you have an upper basin and a lower basin. You pump in all the fecal matter, so the water gets good and nasty. And then there is decomposition that occurs. And there's a lot of filtration that will occur between them because gravity is allowed to draw that water down into the lower basin. And that, in theory, will remove a lot of the contaminants to a point that this water can be further treated, returned to a body of water. A lot of the nutrients, the nitrogen and other nutrients, have theoretically been removed from it, although that's not always the case. Then this is going to be happening over the course of several weeks to several months to, an indeterminate amount of time. Now, here's an example of a lagoon. This is a manure lagoon, and I don't want to say it's a manure lagoon because it's in my hometown. We don't have a wastewater treatment plant, so this is where all of our toilet water goes. So that's actually a human lagoon, but it's the same thing. You see that there's an area in the middle, and you have a higher basin and a lower basin. I can't really tell right now. I think this one's the higher one. That's at least the way it was on the photo. That is the higher one, and the water is going down here. And after it's had time to decompose, the water is then returned into the nearby river, because it's clean enough to release it into nature. So it's a very efficient method of cleaning up the waste buildup. It can also be a source of fertilizer, not the one for humans. Again, this is only for a photo that I showed you. But the cattle or the anything from chickens or poultry can be used as a source of fertilizer once it's been slightly processed. It can, like I said in the past, it can lead to more nitrous oxide release during the denitrification process. There's also potential for flooding. And if flooding occurs, if there's a huge major rain event and there's overland flooding, you can have these nutrients returning to a nearby body of water, leading to eutrophication, which again results in hypoxia. You can also have coliform bacteria. And coliform bacteria is the group of bacteria that E. coli belongs to. You might have heard of E. coli, like the letter E and then coli for coliform. That is the bacteria that is naturally found in the digestive tracts and the intestinal tracts of animals. And some of them are healthy, but some of them are toxic, and it can lead to serious food poisoning. So an alternative to these CAFOs is free-range grazing. And free-range grazing is when you allow these animals to roam without being caged. Now, there is a pasture here, and this pasture, is fenced in, but they're not living, in a confined cage. And also, you can alternate these cages or these pastures. So they might be in this pasture for, a month. And then once they eat up the grass, they can be moved to another pasture, and then they can be cycled around. So you're not depleting all of the grass at once. This allows for natural growth, so you don't have to administer antibiotics. You don't have to administer hormones, because the goal is not to get them big as fast as possible. Also, you're eliminating the need for corn and grain. So you don't have to have any of those associated impacts. And you can use the waste products as a fertilizer, or it can just be let to fertilize the grass that is going to be growing in this pasture. Now, this process is more expensive because you're, again, not really focused on maximizing your production. So it takes longer, it requires more space, that costs money. It can lead to soil compaction because the animals are walking on the same area over and over and over again. It will release or reduce the size of the pores in the soil. And it can also lead to desertification, because if the grass is allowed to be depleted entirely, this is an example of a tragedy of the commons. When grass is depleted all the way, it can no longer hold the soil, and anytime it rains or the wind blows, the topsoil can be removed, and that can lead to desertification, or the conversion of an area into a desert, basically. Now, some impacts of free-range farming. Of course, we're using it to feed the human population, but it requires a lot of time, like I said. So this is because the animals are slow to gain the weight. So that can overall lead to climate change, because there might be more methane released during the lifetime of the organism, or other fossil fuels that are involved in the raising of these organisms. It can also be more expensive, which means the reason it's more expensive is because the labor that goes into it and the care that these animals are given is time consuming. More antibiotics are less antibiotics are required because there is less chance of a disease to be spread. Can lead to soil erosion because of the overgrazing, and the soil erosion can lead to, can lead to habitat destruction, which habitat destruction because this desertification does not allow the same types of plants to exist. And because of the free range farming, we can have organic fertilizer because this manure can be spread around in our soil. So in order to produce proteins, we require a lot of water. For a typical burger that has 113 grams of meat, of beef, it requires 112 liters of water. For sheep or goats, it requires 63 liters of water. Pork production is 57 liters of water per gram of protein. For chicken, requires 34 liters of water. By the way, please don't write these numbers down. You don't really have to know that. You should just understand, relatively speaking, which one requires the most water. For dairy, it requires around the same amount as it does for protein, 31 liters. For eggs, 29 liters, less than it does for chicken and poultry meat. Vegetables still require, not as much, but it's still a considerable amount compared to poultry production, but has 26 liters of water. Grain production is slightly less with 21 liters. And legumes or like beans, for example, require 19 liters of water. So some drawbacks to meat production is we produce a lot of methane. And methane is 24 times more, has 25 times more or 24 times more warming potential than carbon dioxide, which means one methane molecule can do a lot more damage than one CO2 molecule. It can also lead to denitrification, again, because we're impacted the nitrogen cycle. That can lead to an increase in this greenhouse gas of nitrous oxide. Also, we're requiring a lot more land, and the land is not really for the actual farms or for the CAFOs. The land goes for the food that needs to be fed to these animals. When I was recently I was in my hometown, and there's cornfield. But the corn is not for human consumption. The corn is predominantly to feed the cows. And finally, it can lead to a tragedy of the commons, and that is as a result of overgrazing. So I recently visited a dairy farm that was where my cousin works, and she gave me a tour of it, and they did a couple of interesting things. First of all, this is the lovely manure that is coming back to be recycled, having all of the nutrient or all of the liquid extracted from it. And you see you have this nice little powder, looks like kind of like cotton or like little foam pieces. That's basically the dehydrated manure that is now used as bedding. So there's this tractor that comes by, scoops it all up, and then it's basically recycled. So even though overall there's a lot of other environmental impacts from a large dairy farm like this one, there is actually some sustainable agricultural practices that are occurring. So it's not all doom and gloom. So I gave you a lot of information. Please show me what you've learned. Check for understanding. And finally, let's practice. I want you to describe one human and one environmental impact of CAFOs. I hope that this video was informative. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you soon.